In the late 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the largest states in Europe and one which had previously been among the great powers for centuries, disappeared. In what was one of the most drastic redrawings of borders in history, the three surrounding powers of Russia, Austria and Prussia came together and partitioned the country among themselves in a bit more than 2 decades. But how was this even possible? How does a state even get partitioned, and what did it mean for the people who suddenly found themselves under a new monarch? What were the main driving forces, and could things have gone differently? These are the questions that I am going to try to answer over the course of this series, in which we will take a close look at the history of the Polish Partitions. And this first episode is going to be about the prelude to the First Partition. First off, I want to make it very clear that this episode is not going to be a history of Poland in the 18th century, and I will skip over a lot of events and simplify others. Rather, I want to focus on the very specific reasons that allowed Poland's neighbours to exploit the internal domestic issues for their own gain, and I want to explain how the once mighty Commonwealth became a Russian protectorate with almost no sovereignty, whose very existence depended on the goodwill of its neighbours. The first question that inevitably comes up when discussing the prehistory of the Polish partitions is when one should locate the sort of starting point of the decline. One tempting option would be the crisis of the late 17th century. In 1648, the local conflicts with the Cossacks in Ukraine had escalated into an organised uprising against Polish rule, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky. After 6 years of conflict without any sort of resolution, the Cossack leadership swore an oath of allegiance to Russian Tsar Alexei I in 1654. In response, Russia invaded Poland and advanced far to the west. Sweden, which was the undisputed power in the Baltic Sea region, was concerned about Russia's growing power and sensed an opportunity in Poland's moment of weakness, which is why it eventually invaded the Commonwealth itself. Almost all of Poland-Lithuania was occupied within a short period of time, and the country quickly fell into internal crisis. The Swedish occupation was particularly disastrous for the population, as the army fed itself from the land and did not shy away from looting. After the Polish army had gradually succeeded in driving out the Swedes, it attempted to regain control of Ukraine, but only succeeded in part. In the Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667, the Dnieper became the new border between Poland, Lithuania and Russia. The entire left bank of Ukraine, including Kiev, was ceded to the Tsarist Empire, which was a painful loss. In addition, the country was devastated and large areas were almost depopulated. It is estimated that a third of the villages and towns were destroyed, and grain production had fallen by half since the beginning of the war. This economic hardship meant that the country was unable to finance a large standing army. In fact, the devastation and destruction that this series of wars caused was so bad that this period in time is known in historiography as the Deluge. While the wars with Sweden and Russia were certainly detrimental and significantly set back the country compared to its neighbours, this wasn't a situation that was impossible to recover from, given enough time and some clever planning. In my view, the economic and political developmental disadvantage that the Commonwealth faced only became irreversible after the turn of the 18th century, more specifically after the end of the Great Northern War. Throughout the 18th century, Poland gradually lost its political agency and was firmly subordinated to the hegemonic interests of its neighbouring countries. The loss of sovereignty meant that Poland's chances of recovery became drastically reduced. But before I go on to explain the sovereignty crisis of the 18th century, I think it makes sense to quickly examine what kind of state the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth even was and how it was run. In short, it was a decentralized constitutional union between Poland and Lithuania with a common parliament, the Sejm, which usually came together every 2 years for a couple of weeks. It was an aristocratic republic in which the nobility, the Szlachta, ran the country, elected the monarch, and enjoyed widespread privileges. The social class of the Szlachta was huge, accounting for around 6 to 7% of the population at the end of the 18th century. It reflected the multi-ethnic character of the country, and when we speak of a Pole during that time period, we usually mean someone who was a member of the Szlachta, regardless of what his ethnicity might have been. The Szlachta formed an economic hierarchy. A tiny portion of them, called the magnates, lived a lavish lifestyle and ruled over giant estates with hundreds of villages, while most didn't even rule over a single village. Formerly, all nobles could participate in politics, But in practice, only landowning nobles or those backed by magnates had real influence and could participate in the same. Compared to the other people living in the Commonwealth, the Szlachta enjoyed various freedoms. They couldn't be taxed without consent, enjoyed a quasi-monopoly over land ownership, a quasi-monopoly on the vital trade on the Vistula River, practiced full legal jurisdiction over the peasants in their estates, were exempted from customs duties, couldn't be imprisoned without due process, had the final say in legislation, elected the monarch, and many, many more. As such, it was the Szlachta who ruled over the country. A monarch could only ascend to the throne after confirming all of the existing privileges and was less of an effective ruler rather than a source of concessions and rewards in exchange for apparently noble deeds. It was practically impossible for any monarch to revoke these privileges, and the Szlachta enjoyed what they called Złota Wolność, the golden freedom. As I've mentioned, the country was ruled in a decentralized manner from regional parliaments known as sejmiki. There the nobles of the area came together several times a year to elect officials and judges, discuss forms of taxation, and to send envoys to the Sejm in Warsaw. There's one last privilege we need to talk about, and that was arguably the most important one. The liberum veto, the right to forbid. Every single deputy in the Sejm had the power to veto any legislation that might harm the Commonwealth. And while that was useful in the beginning, as it made sure that compromises were reached and that no one was outvoted, by the end of the 17th century the liberum veto was increasingly abused to absolutely halt all legislation in its tracks. All agreements that had previously been reached in the Sejm or the sejmiki could simply be blocked by one man, which would prove absolutely fatal in the next century. Thus, the Commonwealth became ungovernable, as any monarch who wanted to rule would inevitably have had to curtail the privileges of the Szlachta, which was impossible to do because in order to pass laws he needed the approval of the Szlachta, who would of course never agree to any restriction of their golden freedom. The Szlachta considered their privileges to be the result of a centuries-long effort of their forefathers, reaching back to medieval times, and were ready to defend them at all costs. To do so, they had the right to form so-called confederacies in case of an internal or external threat to the country, which was a kind of legal rebellion. But in practice, confederacies were usually set up in response to the monarchy abusing its power, or to preserve old privileges. The golden freedom was here to stay. Now that we've got that sorted, let's go back to the Great Northern War and its consequences. In 1697, a new king had been crowned, Augustus II, who was simultaneously the Elector of Saxony. Augustus was a very ambitious man who wanted to strengthen his reputation in foreign affairs. In order to do that, he entered a military alliance with the Russian Tsar Peter I in 1699. 1 year later, that alliance came into effect when the Great Northern War broke out, which was mostly a conflict between Sweden and Russia over dominance in the Baltic region and in which Poland-Lithuania had very little to gain. Still, a Saxon army marched into Swedish Livonia in 1700 with the goal of conquering the port city of Riga for personal prestige reasons. Among the Polish Szlachta, Augustus's campaign was extremely unpopular and resistance against the king began to grow. Very quickly, what began as a quick military expedition turned into a national catastrophe, as King Charles XII of Sweden managed to chase the Saxon army away from Riga and then led his army into Commonwealth territory. The Swedes took Wilno or Vilnius, Warsaw and Kraków and decisively defeated the Polish army at the battles of Kliszów and Półtusk. In 1704, Sweden backed the creation of the Confederation of Warsaw, which had the goal of removing Augustus from the throne and to put Stanisław Leszczyński in his place instead. In response, the Confederation of Sandomierz was created, which was supported by Russia and had the goal of defending King Augustus. With that, Poland was now in a civil war as well. In 1706, Charles XII marched into Saxony and it seemed like Sweden had come out on top. Augustus had no choice but to sign the Treaty of Alt-Ranstedt, in which he renounced his claim on the Polish throne in favour of Leszczyński. But Sweden's war luck began to turn as Russian troops advanced and gained the upper hand. After his victory at Poltava, he had managed to greatly increase his influence. Leszczyński and his supporters fled, the Confederation of Warsaw was disbanded, and Augustus returned to the throne. Once again, a devastating and destructive war had swept over Poland-Lithuania, but this time the country was no longer a major player, but merely a battleground for the Russian and Swedish armies. What's worse, however, is that a deep mistrust now existed between King Augustus and the ruling nobility, which were subsequently exploited by Tsar Peter I. Throughout his reign, Augustus had attempted to consolidate his power in Poland, strengthen his authority by introducing an absolutist system of rule, and to turn the Polish-Saxon personal union into a political union. But he failed, partly because he never truly understood the complex mechanisms of the Polish constitutional system, and because the Szlachta were absolutely determined not to let any monarch infringe on their privileges. Even when the king occasionally proposed sensible reforms like the abolition of the liberum veto, the introduction of a hereditary monarchy, and the limitation of the privileges of the hetman, the leader of the Polish army, he was stopped in his tracks. This was much to the benefit of Peter I, who had the goal of increasing Polish dependence on Russia and of preventing any kind of reform that might strengthen the Commonwealth and make it a formidable opponent of Russia again. After his victory at Poltava, he had greatly managed to increase his influence. One of the conditions for Augustus's return to the throne was that he appoint people who have strong connections to Russia to important offices. One example for this was the Grand Hetman of Lithuania, and in general a strong pro-Russian party emerged among the ruling class. By travelling through the country, Peter had realised just how great the predominance of the wealthy magnates was, who de facto ruled over Poland and were united by a great egotism and a desire to keep the monarch weak. The Tsar knew that he could easily pit the Szlachta and the king against each other, and that's what he did after 1715. That year, a number of nobles formed the Tarnogród Confederation against the king, due to the unconstitutional presence of the Saxon army in Poland, which were brought in by Augustus in an effort to increase his authority and were to be financed with Polish tax money. Russian armies then intervened in Poland, and Peter offered himself as a mediator in the civil war. He supported the rebels when the king's camp gained the upper hand, and supported Augustus when there was a threat of him being deposed. In 1716, the Russian diplomat in Warsaw, Grigory Dolgorukov, managed to convince King Augustus to permanently withdraw the Saxon army from Poland. In return, the Sejm had to agree to a massive limitation on military spending. In doing so, neither the king nor the nobles could ever threaten each other again in the future. The treaty was put before the Sejm in January 1717, who had sworn to neither debate nor protest it and to ratify it. And so the silent or dumb Sejm, surrounded by Russian soldiers, accepted the proposal of the Tsar. By reducing its army size so drastically, Poland-Lithuania practically signed off its independence as it became completely unable to defend itself. To illustrate just how terrible Poland's military situation was after the Russian intervention, I'll present a few numbers to you. The Silent Sejm had agreed to restrict its army size to 24,000 men in all ranks. For a country of this size, this was very little, and the situation would only get worse. By the 1760s, the Commonwealth's army numbered barely half of that. By comparison, Russia fielded around 200,000 soldiers, Prussia 150,000, and Austria a respectable 140,000. But Poland's army wasn't just falling behind in sheer numbers, but also in quality. The Polish soldiers were chronically underpaid, ill-disciplined, had no battle experience, and were subjected to an ineffective line of command divided between the four hetmans, 2 Crown, 2 Lithuanian, whose rivalries constantly undermined cohesion, while the neighbouring countries could rely on professional armies with battle-hardened soldiers. There were attempts to reform the army in the mid-18th century and to expand it, but as was so often the case, the liberum veto put a wrench in the works. But Russian supremacy in Poland was not yet set in stone. Worried by the growing influence of Russia in northern and eastern Europe, the King of Britain, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Augustus in his role as Elector of Saxony signed the Treaty of Vienna in 1719 with the goal of forcing a retreat of Russian troops from the Commonwealth. But for that treaty to have any effect, Poland would have to join it, and the decision for that needed to be made by the Sejm. This was more or less a golden opportunity to undo the Russian influence in the country and to return to the status quo before the war. Tsar Peter knew this very well, which is why he did everything in his power to disrupt the Sejm proceedings. Using a combination of bribery and exploiting old-standing suspicions of an increase in royal authority, he managed to do just that. The issue was that, according to the treaty, Jakob Heinrich von Flemming, one of the most influential ministers of King Augustus, was supposed to take command over foreign army contingents. And so Poland's accession to the Treaty of Vienna was blocked by the disgruntled hetmans who were upset about having some of their privileges removed by the Silent Sejm. Evidently, a large number of Sejm deputies still hadn't realised the threat that Russia posed for the sovereignty of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As the Great Northern War came to an end in 1721, Poland's chances of overcoming the loss of sovereignty and the dependence on Russia dwindled. With the Treaty of Neustadt, both Sweden and Poland-Lithuania were reduced to secondary powers in a new system of European alliances. Russia was the uncontested dominant power in Eastern Europe, and for Prussia and Austria, good relations with the Tsarist Empire were now the top priority. In 1720, Tsar Peter entered an alliance with the King of Prussia, Frederick William I. In the Treaty of Potsdam, the two states agreed to work together in matters concerning internal affairs of Poland-Lithuania. They promised each other to maintain the elective monarchy and to prevent any attempt at reforming the existing form of government. While both Prussia and Russia both intended to keep the Commonwealth weak, they had different goals. As I've mentioned, Peter wanted to keep Poland under Russian hegemony and to turn it into a kind of buffer zone along the empire's western borders. Prussia, on the other hand, wanted to annex territories. The Prussian dominion in the early 18th century resembled a patchwork of various territories, and most importantly, East Prussia, with the highly important city of Königsberg, was separated from the Brandenburgian and Pomeranian lands surrounding the capital city Berlin by Commonwealth territory. Frederick William hoped that by keeping Poland-Lithuania weak, he could one day absorb Polish Royal Prussia to unite his territories. The treaty was continuously renewed and would remain in place until the final Polish Partition. The fact that the Russian system of supremacy was to remain in place became apparent during the royal elections following the death of Augustus II in 1733. France had been preparing for this election for a long time, as it wanted to keep the Tsarist Empire in check. To this end, it supported the exiled Stanisław Leszczyński, who had already held the Polish throne for a short time during the Great Northern War. However, Russian Empress Anna was confident of the support of Prussia and Austria. In 1732, the three powers formed the Entente Cordiale of the Three Black Eagles. In it, they declared that after the death of Augustus II, they wanted to prevent both Leszczyński and another Saxon from becoming heir to the throne. Shortly afterwards, however, the Empress made a U-turn and, in breach of the treaty, assured Saxony of her support for the candidacy of Augustus II's son. Prussia saw a renewed Saxon-Polish union as a threat and feared encirclement. Although it withdrew from the Entente Cordiale, it nevertheless indirectly supported the Russian plan, as a Polish king supported by France was considered a far greater danger in Berlin. Thus, the next Polish king was decided before the election had even taken place. The actual election took place in Warsaw in September 1733, and Stanisław Leszczyński was voted to be the next Polish king. In response, Austria and Russia declared their support for a Saxon candidate, and Russia marched into Poland-Lithuania to enforce its demands. Once again, the Commonwealth became entangled into a destructive war caused by its neighbours with no agency over its own fate. Russian troops very quickly reached Warsaw, and in October of the same year a new sham election was held in which the Saxon Augustus III emerged as the winner. In January 1734, he was coronated as King of Poland-Lithuania in Kraków. Leszczyński and his supporters had fled to Danzig or Gdańsk, and soon after the city was put under siege. It only surrendered in May 1734, after Leszczyński had escaped to Prussia. Afterwards, some nobles loyal to Leszczyński under the leadership of Adam Tarło proclaimed the Confederation of Dzików with the goal of ousting the illegitimate Saxon king. They boldly attempted to carry the war to Saxony by marching across the Oder River, but they didn't get far before being crushed by Russian and Saxon troops. The War of Polish Succession ended in 1735, and Augustus III was confirmed as King of Poland-Lithuania. With the end of the war, the dominance over Poland by Russia, Prussia and Austria became firmly established and would never be rivaled again by another European power. In the so-called Pacification Sejm of 1736, Augustus III was confirmed as king after he had promised not to attempt any reforms or to challenge Russian dominance. The system of the Three Black Eagles thus prevented any sort of political emancipation of the Commonwealth for the What is more, the system proved to be very durable, even though inner tensions between the three eagles quickly emerged. In 1740, the new king of Prussia, Frederick II, marched into Austrian Silesia and triggered a series of wars which lasted until 1763. The most famous of these wars is known as the 7 Years' War, in which Prussia faced not only Austria but also Russia, which wanted to put Frederick back in his place. With a combination of military skill and sheer luck, Prussia managed to narrowly avoid complete destruction and emerged from the war as the victor. It was allowed to keep the highly valuable province of Silesia, and it rose up to the rank of a great European power. For Poland-Lithuania, the 7 Years' War did not bode well. While it wasn't dragged into another war by the great powers, and while its land wasn't absolutely devastated again, Prussia quickly reintegrated itself into Russian foreign policy, and cooperated with the Tsarist Empire on how to deal with Poland. The system of the 3 Black Eagles returned, and this time they no longer necessarily insisted on the permanence of Poland's borders. After all, Austria had lost a lot of land, and the possibility emerged that it might be compensated at the Commonwealth's expense. For the time being, this was out of the question, because Russia wanted to preserve Poland-Lithuania as a weak buffer state, but it was only going to be a matter of time until that would change. It can be said that it was the ignorance, the egotism and the short-sightedness of many layers of the nobility which allowed the 3 Eagles to abuse Poland-Lithuania's political system and to keep the country in an eternal state of weakness. But that doesn't mean that there were no attempts at reform. In the 1720s, so still under Augustus II's reign, a new political faction emerged which enjoyed full support of the Saxon court and that attempted to gain important offices in the country. The party was called Family, and it was headed by the powerful Czartoryski family, who sought to introduce new reform. Their ambitions were met with a lot of opposition in the parliament, particularly from the Potocskis, another influential magnate family, who quickly became the family's biggest rivals. Much to the benefit of the Black Eagles, this new rivalry could easily be exploited to prevent any sort of progress. In the last 4 years of Augustus II's rule, every single same session was disrupted and nothing of substance was achieved. After the ascension of Augustus III, the rivalry between the family and the Potocskis remained at the core of Polish internal politics. Even though the Potocskis initially held the upper hand because they and their supporters had gained the hetman's offices, the family did not give up. It lobbied for support among the Szlachta and shifted to a pro-Russian stance. This might seem counterintuitive, but at the time it made sense. The desires of Berlin to annex Royal Prussia was not a secret in Warsaw, and it was clear that in case of a Prussian invasion, the Commonwealth was clearly unable to defend itself. As such, Russia was the only major power that could prevent a Prussian invasion. Unfortunately, the family underestimated St. Petersburg's own ambitions, and the secret clauses of the Prusso-Russian Treaty of 1720 were unknown to them. At the same session of 1738, the family called for a number of important economic and political reforms. In short, they wanted to ensure domestic order, expand the army, reform the financing of said army, and the withdrawal of the Russian forces. Due to the resistance of the Potocskis and their supporters, the Sejm ended without passing any resolution. The same thing happened to the next Sejm, held in 1740, which had scattered over a debate over tax reductions. The Sejm that got closest to achieving anything under Augustus III was the one which was held in Grodno in 1744. The family had the full support of the court and various magnates. Reforms that were discussed were an expansion of the army, an administrative and judicial reform, as well as a close alliance with Russia. Ultimately, however, Russia wanted to prevent any sort of state reform, and with the usual strategy of abusing the liberum veto system, made sure that the Grodno Sejm dispersed without any results. It was clear that the situation was quite hopeless. The successive Sejm sessions of 1746 and 1748 also proved fruitless. Ultimately, the period between the crowning of Augustus III and the Sejm of 1748 proved to be a wasted chance for reforming the state, and such an opportunity would never come up again. All the efforts of the family, the court and reformist nobles were consistently blocked by the Potocskis and Russia. Just when Poland-Lithuania needed reforms the most, the country entered a fatal political standstill. Any sort of inner transformation of the Commonwealth was out of the question, and on the international stage, it failed to regain sovereignty. During the whole almost 30-year-long reign of King Augustus III, only a single Sejm session was able to pass any sort of legislation. Strangely, many Polish nobles saw absolutely no issue in their country's deadlock. When the French ambassador Antoine Félix de Monti tried to warn his acquaintances in 1732 of the threat posed by Poland's neighbours, he wasn't taken particularly seriously. They replied that Poland has always been governed this way, that the interest of Europe requires that Poland's present form of government should continue, lest any of the neighbouring princes annexes it. Evidently, very little criticism was voiced against the fundamental institutions of the Commonwealth. Whenever someone did speak up, it was usually against corrupt individuals rather than the system as a whole. Most members of the Szlachta had never left Poland-Lithuania and travelled to other countries. The Commonwealth was all they knew, and rapid developments in Western Europe, such as the spread of the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, were noted with very little interest. Instead, it was the clergy who voiced concern with their country's political backwardness and attempted to do something about it. In 1737, the Theatine Order opened up a small school in Warsaw in which a modern curriculum was taught, which included modern languages, fencing, dancing, sciences, and new literature. In 1740, Father Stanisław Konarski from the Piarist Order opened up the College of Nobles, also in Warsaw. It attempted to offer the wealthy nobility an education similar to what you would receive in France or Italy. More Piarist schools were opened up throughout the country in the following decade, and in the 1750s the Jesuits also founded a number of similar schools. Unfortunately, all these schools achieved little to change the nobility's outlook on the world. Because the schools were financed with tuition fees and most of their students came from the Szlachta, any direct criticism of the Szlachta's politics was avoided. Furthermore, the attachment of the nobility to their privileges and the golden freedom proved too high to be overcome. In the eyes of the Szlachta, whatever flaws the Commonwealth may have, its system was still preferable to a despotic monarchy like in Prussia, Austria and France, or a plutocratic republic like in Britain and the Netherlands. They saw no reason to worry. Poland-Lithuania had survived so many devastating wars, so many crises, and yet it had recovered. Everything would be alright in the end, they believed. In 1733, Father Konarski tried to warn his countrymen in a series of published letters, where he told them that their freedoms meant nothing if Poland-Lithuania itself wasn't even fully sovereign. His warnings fell largely on deaf ears, and most nobles underestimated the foreign influence. In 1763, Konarski proposed the abolition of the liberum veto in order to strengthen Poland-Lithuania again, which didn't earn him a lot of popularity. Another problem was that Konarski, despite his smart ideas on how the country should be reformed, had no palpable solution for how Poland could get rid of foreign dominance. Probably because there really was none. It was a great tragedy that most Polish nobles clung onto the liberum veto, which did so much damage to their country. They failed to understand that a more centralized government didn't have to be despotic, and that in order for Poland to become a functioning state again, the Szlachta would inevitably have to give up some of their rights. Overall, the reign of Augustus III remained largely uneventful. Unlike his father, the king wasn't particularly power-hungry or ambitious, and he was happy to play the role of a symbolic figurehead. As a result of the fact that the central government became unable to achieve anything, most of the administrative work was carried out by the local seimiki and nobles who made sure that the country could function at a relatively normal level. Many magnates began to be interested in new economic theories like mercantilism, and they introduced new forms of agriculture on their estates, which greatly increased productivity. New manufactories were founded in the cities, and particularly in northwestern Poland, trade flourished. Therefore, on an economic level, Poland-Lithuania was able to largely make up for the backwardness it had suffered as a result of the destructive wars of the 18th century. So it was by no means an age of anarchy or cultural decline. Under the Saxon kings, Warsaw flourished into a breathtaking royal seat that was in no way inferior to its model, Dresden, in terms of splendour. For example, the so-called Saxon Axis was created, along which magnificent buildings were erected such as the Saxon Palace, the Brühl Palace or the Saxon Park. In the 1740s, an opera was built in the capital as well. Many powerful magnates built stunning palaces to show off their wealth. In the 18th century, Warsaw was a capital of culture in which the opera, the arts, theatre and music flourished. In 1748, Bishop Józef Załuski founded the Załuski Library, which was the first public library in Europe and would grow to house some 400,000 meticulously catalogued volumes. For those who could afford it, the reign of Augustus III was a time of opulence, pleasure and leisure. After the king died in 1763, those good old Saxon days came to an end, as Poland was once again thrown into a violent crisis when the next royal election came up. But like the previous one, this royal election was by no means free, as the winner had already been chosen by St. Petersburg. Catherine II, Empress of Russia since 1762, had picked her former lover, Stanisław August Poniatowski, a rather uninfluential nobleman who had previously been a deputy in the Sejm. Catherine hadn't picked him because of his intelligence, his ruling skills, or his standing among the Szlachta. Instead, all she wanted was a weak-minded and submissive Polish ruler who had no connections to any other European dynasties and would do as she said. Her ambitions were supported by Prussia, and before the royal election, both Berlin and St. Petersburg promised to start a military action against Poland in case their interests were threatened or if the current Polish constitution was changed. In 1764, Stanisław August Poniatowski was crowned king with the help of Russian bribes and Russian troops stationed around Warsaw. But interestingly, the death of the last Saxon king had already inspired a new wave of reforms. Immediately after the death of Augustus III, a Sejm was held between May and June 1764, which was primarily tasked with preparing the royal election. The Sejm was led by a member of the Czartoryskis, and the family completely dominated the proceedings as most of their opponents had abstained from the session in protest against the presence of Russian troops and declared it illegal. The family seized its chance and introduced a series of groundbreaking reforms. They set up treasury and army commissions, which were important steps in reforming the administration of the country. As a result, the finances could be brought in order and the power of the hetmans was finally curtailed. But most importantly, votes within both commissions were decided by majority vote. This meant that in financial and military matters, the liberum veto was factually abolished. These radical steps were only possible because the circumstances were particularly favourable. The current Russian ambassador to Poland, Hermann von Kaiserling, was an old friend of the Czartoryskis, and he was nearing his death. His junior partner, Nikolai Rybnin, who would play a very important role later, was still too inexperienced to stop the reforms from passing. The reformers were overly confident, maybe even cocky, and believed that they could simply circumvent the Russian protectors and put them before a fait accompli. And indeed, it would take St. Petersburg 2 years to notice just how far-reaching the reforms of the 1764 Sejm actually were. While the Empress initially allowed the Polish reformers to have their way, the Prussian king sensed the significance of their actions. Frederick II was furious when he found out that Russia had allowed this first step towards fully abolishing the liberum veto, which could only lead to further reform and a strengthening of the Commonwealth. The Prussian ambassador in St. Petersburg worked tirelessly to convince Catherine of Frederick's point of view. Meanwhile, the king took drastic action himself. The Sejm of 1764 had also enacted a general duty on all Polish imports and exports, which would have greatly boosted state income and would have given the Commonwealth more financial independence. Frederick was having none of it, and he ordered the construction of a fortified customs house at Marienwerder, or Kwidzyn, right along the Polish border at the Vistula River, which was the artery of Polish trade. The soldiers were equipped with cannons and ordered to bombard any ships that refused to pay the extortionate Prussian duties. Eventually, Catherine intervened and ordered Frederick to stop the operation. In exchange, the Poles were forced to abandon their reformed duties. Once again, it was made very clear to everyone that the Commonwealth had no right to decide its own policies. To Catherine's surprise, it turned out that King Stanisław August Poniatowski did not want to be the Empress's submissive servant, but instead pursued rather ambitious goals. He wanted to strengthen Poland-Lithuania and free the country from its political stalemate. But that wasn't as easy as he had hoped. Just before the first Sejm of his reign in 1766, the king and the family proposed a new law which clarified the law regarding majority vote and the financial commission. They proposed that from now on, any issue that came from the commission would have to be passed by a single majority, no matter what it was. Jerzy Mniszek, the Marshal of the Crown Court and a fierce opponent of Stanisław August Poniatowski, immediately warned the Russian ambassador, Nikolai Rybnin. It was now that Rybnin realized the dangers this posed for Russian dominance. He warned the Polish king that he would tear Warsaw down, stone by stone, if this measure were passed. Initially, the king wanted to resist, but his Czartoryski allies told him that this was pointless. After all, Poland-Lithuania had no chance of defending itself against a Russian invasion. By using pressure, Rjepnin made sure that the Sejm didn't restrict the liberum veto and that all major reforms from 2 years ago, except for the army and financial commissions, were undone. In the end, Russian interests had prevailed, but it was a close affair. St. Petersburg feared that Poland-Lithuania could actually fall out of its grasp. They needed to make sure that this didn't happen. Consequently, Russia began to present itself as the protector of the Orthodox minority in Poland-Lithuania. Ever since the 16th century, the Commonwealth had allowed all of its religious groups the right to practice their faith, which made it one of the most tolerant countries in that regard. It is true, however, that Protestants and the Eastern Orthodox were increasingly marginalized from political life in the 18th century. Despite this, the situation of the religious minorities was still better than in other European countries, and they had little reason to complain. But that didn't dissuade Catherine, and it was obvious that she was playing a deceitful game. As Frederick II remarked, "What would," he meant the Russian minister, "say if France were to invade Holland in order to force the Estates General to admit papists to public charges? Would he not say that France had been the aggressor? But apply this to the present situation in Poland. It's the Russians who are the aggressors." Not that the famously irreligious Prussian king saw this strategy as morally wrong, because he happily partook in this game to present himself as the protector of Protestants in Western Poland. In 1767, religious turmoil broke out in the Commonwealth. 2 armed confederations were formed by disgruntled nobles, one for the Protestants in Torn or Torun, and the other one for Calvinists and the Orthodox in Słupsk or Slutsk. These confederations were only organized and supported by a small minority of disgruntled noblemen and cannot possibly be seen as a mass movement of discriminated religious minorities. They were very small and only existed because of Russian meddling. This becomes evident when looking at Torn, for example, where the confederation was formed with heavy support from Russia. Everyone in the city who opposed it was subsequently arrested. The Russian ambassador Rjepnin then went on to organize another confederation at Radom, using a combination of false promises, bribes, and threats. In the confederation of Radom, a confusing bunch of dissatisfied nobles came together. Some wanted to dethrone the king, others wanted to block the reform program, others just wanted a return of the splendid Saxon days before the chaos, and others wanted to defend the Catholic Church. But they all had one thing in common. They were being used by Rjepnin, who exploited the disorder to his full advantage. He arranged a peace between the king and the Radom Confederation and arranged an extraordinary session of the Sejm. The same session was opened in October 1767, once again not without the presence of Russian troops in the vicinity. On the first day, Karol Radziwiłł, the marshal of the Confederation of Radom and one of the biggest opponents of the king and the reformers, called on the Sejm to renegotiate a treaty with Russia. He demanded that Russia should act as a guarantor of internal and external freedom and that the rights of religious minorities should be enshrined in the constitution. Those ideas were very unpopular among the nobles, and particularly among the Catholic clergy, opposition began to be voiced. When leading Sejm deputies began to demand the withdrawal of Russian forces, Rjepnin acted fast. He arrested the 4 leading voices of his opposition and sent them to Russia. This is how he justified this action before the king. "The troops of Her Imperial Majesty, my sovereign and the friend and ally of the Republic, have arrested the Bishop of Kraków, the Bishop of Kiev, the Palatine of Kraków and the Starosta of Dolin, whose behaviour, by impugning the purity of her salutary, disinterested and loving intentions towards the Republic, has insulted the dignity of Her Imperial Majesty." The Marshal of the Sejm then abdicated to protest the deportations, and he was replaced by a supporter of Rjepnin. Stanisław August Poniatowski had no choice but to abandon his reform projects for the time being and to seek a compromise with the Russian ambassador. Rjepnin then pushed a motion through the Sejm which allowed the creation of a delegation with unrestricted powers to draft a treaty between the Russian Empire and Poland-Lithuania. The commission consisted of 70 members, many of whom were loyal supporters of Rjepnin, and they convened until February 1768 at the residence of the Russian ambassador. In March, the treaty was presented to the Sejm, who had no choice but to accept it. And what a treaty it was. It completely undid the few reforms of Stanisław August Poniatowski's early years and reintroduced the liberum veto as an almost unrestricted measure. Furthermore, all the damaging privileges of the Szlachta, like the royal elections and the confederations, were confirmed as indispensable rights. As this was a Russian-Polish treaty, Russia effectively gained the right to interfere in internal political affairs of the Commonwealth. Another important point was that Russia guaranteed Poland's territorial integrity, albeit with reservations. Remember the Treaty of Andrusovo of 1667, where Russia gained all of eastern Ukraine? Back then, the Tsar also had his eyes on the voivodeships of Polotsk, Vitebsk and Livonia, but ultimately decided against it. Nevertheless, a commission was to be set up at that time to determine the definitive course of the border. Now, 100 years later, the new treaty provided for a new border commission. The question of the Polish-Russian border was thus raised again. With that, St. Petersburg managed both to guarantee the territorial integrity of the Commonwealth and to leave the door open to future territorial annexations for themselves. With this so-called eternal treaty, Poland-Lithuania submitted to the Empress and confirmed its own status as a protectorate. Catherine II emerged as the victor. The Commonwealth was now almost completely powerless, and there was no chance it could ever pass any sort of reform ever again. The pro-Russian party dominated political life, and the Russian ambassador held full control. But her time at the top wouldn't last long. Mere days after the signing of the treaty, rebellious nobles formed the Bar Confederation in Podolia and organized armed resistance. They demanded the resignation of Stanisław August Poniatowski, in whom they saw only a Russian puppet, the termination of the treaty, and to restore the dominance of the Catholic Church. Russia had to intervene militarily to maintain its position of power. When the Ottoman Empire also declared war on the Tsarist Empire, Catherine became embroiled in a military conflict that would last 4 years. The Polish question now became internationally relevant. This conflict only ended with the First Partition of Poland in 1772. However, we will only look at exactly how this came about, how the partitions took place, and what consequences it would have in the next episode. So, I know that this was a lot of information across almost 100 years of history with so many characters and motivations, so I'll try to wrap it up with a nice conclusion. In the first half of the 18th century, Poland-Lithuania was dragged into a series of catastrophic wars it had a very hard time recovering from. It was very difficult to govern a country which was ruled in such a decentralized manner and in which the nobility enjoyed so many harmful privileges which they considered to be God-given. Poland's political system was deeply flawed and inefficient, and it was already hard enough to introduce any number of reforms. But it needs to be stressed that Poland's internal weaknesses were mercilessly exploited by its powerful neighbours for almost a century to benefit their own goals. In particular, it was Russia, starting with Peter the Great, who did everything in its power to keep the Commonwealth in an eternal state of weakness. Russia, together with its allies, did everything it could to undo even the smallest bit of progress the Poles might have achieved, mostly resorting to bribery, blackmail and open oppression. It was an impossible situation to recover from, no matter how intelligent the Polish king might have been, or how willing the Szlachta were to reform. To Russia, Prussia and Austria, the partition of Poland was only the next logical step. Alright then, dankeschön for watching the video. I hope you liked it and that you learned something new about this fascinating time in history. As you might think, making these videos is very difficult and time consuming, so if you want to make sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier level, a number of other very sweet benefits. In any case, I want to thank my invaluable supporters, without whom this wouldn't even be possible. Marius Gerling, Leader Titan, Maurice Lopez, Der dicke Flipper, Ich liebe Emden und Groningen, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, Pseudoriser, Lyle Furphy, Yin, Big Dave, Folling and Turd Hambone. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.